I want to talk a little bit about the threat of nuclear terrorism, and I apologize to those of you for whom this is not new. There are basically three major types of acts of nuclear terrorism. One is the use of actual nuclear explosives, which is a more plausible threat than many people realize, as I'll talk about more in a moment. Another is simply spreading radioactive material in what's often referred to as a dirty bomb, which would be dramatically easier, but also dramatically less devastating. It could create substantial fear and economic disruption. You might have to evacuate a large area, but it's very unlikely to kill a substantial number of people. And intermediate between those in both difficulty and the scale of the consequences would be sabotage of a nuclear power plant or other major nuclear facility, which could potentially, if it was very successful, have consequences similar to those that we saw at Fukushima. So these are more genuine threats than many people realize. Terrorists have repeatedly considered sabotaging reactors. There has been a case in the past of terrorists, for example, overwhelming armed guards at a nuclear plant and essentially seizing control of the plant for several hours and then managing to melt away without being caught when response forces arrived. Fortunately, the plant was not yet operational in that case. There was also a case of an insider at a nuclear power plant managing to bring explosives into the plant, place them on the steel pressure vessel head, and detonate them. Again, fortunately, before the plant was operational, not intended in either case to actually spread radioactivity, but simply to send a message. It's much easier to make a crude, unsafe, unreliable nuclear bomb that might be delivered in the back of a truck that a terrorist would be interested in than it is to make a safe, reliable, efficient nuclear weapon that you can deliver by missile or aircraft that a state would want. And terrorists have repeatedly tried to do this. 20 years ago, the Japanese terror cult Shinrikyo, which launched the nerve gas attacks in the Tokyo subways, sought nuclear weapons fairly actively. They looked for them in Russia. They tried to make their own. Al-Qaeda had a focused nuclear weapons program that reported directly to Zawahiri. They repeatedly attempted to get nuclear material and to recruit nuclear expertise. They got as far as carrying out explosive tests for their nuclear program in the Afghan desert. And even if Al-Qaeda does not in the future manage to rebuild their nuclear program, over the last 20 years we have at least two and probably more terrorist groups that have pursued nuclear weapons in a serious way, and we can't expect that they'll be the last. So I would argue this is a threat we'll be dealing with for decades to come. Now, no one knows what the real probability is, and there are debates as to whether it's high or whether it's low. But the reality is no one would operate a nuclear power plant upwind of a major city if it had a 1 in 100 chance every year of blowing sky high. Everyone would understand that that risk was too high. I would argue the risk that we're running with the way we manage nuclear materials and facilities in the world today is probably higher than that. So there is an urgent need to do something. So the bottom line, in my view, is nuclear terrorism is a real and urgent threat, and strong nuclear security measures, which is what we're here to talk about today and this week, are the best policy tool we have available to reduce that risk.
We believe, the Fissile Material Working Group, that we need to look at this broader issue, look ahead into the future. What do you do with those existing stocks of materials, the capabilities to produce that, and the future growth? And so on the military side, not only the Fissile Material Working Group, but a lot of non-proliferation experts support a moratorium on production of fissile material leading up to a fissile material cutoff treaty. And we believe that all facilities that can separate plutonium for weapons should be closed. On the civilian side, we have 5 steps that we think we should be taking. The first is to limit the current scale of reprocessing operations globally and work to decrease that scale over time. There are a number of ways that you can do this. You can reduce or eliminate the current reprocessing capability. You can refrain from new facility construction. The Nuclear Suppliers Group is already restricting transfers of sensitive reprocessing equipment and technologies. And you can do something about those excess stockpiles of material. In other words, you can also, work to reduce the stockpiles before you create more of that. At a minimum, we believe that the global plutonium separation capacity should not increase, regardless of where or which countries are actually doing that reprocessing. The second point is we need to stop the expansion of current stockpiles globally and work to reduce them over time. In other words, those existing stockpiles, they need to shrink. They don't need to expand. We need to apply the most stringent standards of safety, security, and accounting, and the protection of public health to all those processes that result in or utilize separated plutonium. So this is not just separation, but also fuel fabrication. And we need to minimize the number of sites where material is used and handled and the number and lengths of transporting. In other words, we don't want to see a lot of material being shipped around the world. And finally, it's 50 years after the dawn of nuclear energy, and there's not a single country that has a repository for waste. We need to get a whole lot more creative about alternatives to spent fuel separation in the civilian sector, and that includes dry cask storage, maybe multilateral approaches on storage and repositories. I'm going to stop there and hand the floor over to Kelsey.
We have teamed up to track the progress made on nuclear security since the summit process began. Our first two reports, which came out in 2011 and 2012, focused specifically on the House gifts or national commitments made at the 2010 summit. And by the Seoul summit in March of 2012, we found that over 90% of these commitments have been met. However, these national commitments represented just a small portion of the activities that states were actually taking to strengthen nuclear security. So the 2013 version of our report that you have in front of you tries to take a more sort of comprehensive picture of the activities that the 53 participating states have taken over the course of the summit process. Now, our research found that all 53 of the states participating in the summit process have taken significant actions to strengthen nuclear security over the course of the summit process. To give you an idea of a few of the numbers, in aggregate, we found that 44 countries have hosted workshops or conferences, have developed centers of excellence or participated in those centers. 9 countries have hosted or requested IPAS missions from the IAEA. 22 countries have taken steps to prevent smuggling of nuclear materials or combat illicit trafficking. And in April of 2013, the Czech Republic became the 10th country in the past 4 years to have eliminated its entire stockpile of highly enriched uranium. So in total, we think that this demonstrates that significant progress has been made in nuclear security. But our report also indicates sort of several gaps that remain, and I'm going to quickly sort of outline 3 of them. One, as I think Sharon has already done an excellent job pointing out, is that there's not nearly enough progress on plutonium and the minimization of plutonium. At the 2012 summit, Sweden announced that it had shipped its excess plutonium back to the United States. Belgium and Italy have made commitments to dispose of excess plutonium by 2014, but still a lot of work remains to be done in the area of plutonium. Also, we found a lack of consistency in reporting at the 2012 summit made it very difficult to create a comprehensive evaluation applicable to all of the countries. So we argue strongly for developing a standardized reporting structure for states to use in 2014 and then again in 2016, now that we know that the summit process will continue until then. Finally, we find that while the first two summits have been an important step in sort of strengthening nuclear security, much more work does remain to be done. The 4-year goal has been a very useful sort of catalyst for action, but it isn't sufficient to meet the threat. The current regime still remains a patchwork of laws and multilateral initiatives. So we think that participants need to define a nuclear security framework with greater transparency and focus on regime cohesion to strengthen and build confidence in the nuclear security regime, sort of beginning with the next summit in 2014. Thank you. And I will now turn it over to Ken.
So, from my perspective, nuclear security is more than just fissile material control or fissile material security. It's really about the rules and the practices that determine how well the global community manages its overall nuclear enterprise on both the civil and the military side. And the goal is to make sure that there are no weak links in the system. So on Friday, I was very interested to read this new op-ed by Director General Amano, in which he clearly says we cannot tolerate any weak links in the system. And I thought that that was very positive. And he also defined the nuclear security issue, I think, the way it needs to be defined, which is fissile material, radiological materials, and then also nuclear facilities, all of these things. But despite the fact that we don't want there to be weak links in the system, there are numerous weak links at this time in the security of nuclear and radiological materials, in the protection of nuclear facilities and infrastructure, and also in safety. So what are the challenges that I see and that our group sees? There are basically 5 different problems, all of which are contained in this report, Responsibility Beyond the Rules. The first is, as others have said, is that we have a very weak patchwork. The system is not cohesive, it lacks enforceable standards, and it relies almost entirely on national actions. So the problem is that the system allows gaps to exist, it allows weak links to exist, and not just to exist, but also to persist. So the way we apply physical security, for example, which Matt can talk about in much more detail, is different in the United States and in Western Europe to some degree than it is in Asia, for example. The second problem is that the system lacks effective information sharing. Now, I would say, somewhat stunned to read in Amano's piece on Friday that he says one simple measure for nuclear security would make a big difference. All countries should allow peer reviews of their nuclear security arrangements by international efforts. That is a total outflanking of the rest of the world by Amano. No one in their national statements, with the exception of the Australians, has ever mentioned the word peer review. Third, we have an insufficiently effective international legal and organizational structure for dealing with this problem. Now, what I think is going on is that the IAEA is recognizing that they need to get ahead of the curve. And I think this op-ed is actually quite dramatic. And I think what they're doing is staking out territory ahead, which I think is a very, very positive thing, because the current system is not adequately organized or cohesive. 4 and 5 are really political issues. There is a complete disconnect, I think, between some countries on the immediacy and the reality of the threat that Matt laid out. And here again, I think Amano, in his piece, made a very good case, which is it's not about countries that have fissile material, it's about all countries, because any country can be a state through which materials or illicit materials are trafficked. And then finally, where is the political will to change the system? These nuclear security summits, politicized in a good way of the definition of that word, raise the political profile of this issue. But in general, I think people have the sense, certainly I do, that they've been underperforming. And so we have 2 more summits, one in The Hague in 2014 in March, and then one in Washington in 2016. So that gives us about 2.5 years to try and make some real progress on this on this agenda. And there has been progress, as Kelsey pointed out in this new report. I mean, a lot has been done. We have reduced the number of countries that have HU on their territory. Countries are taking actions, but they're not taking actions that deal with the governance issues and with the control, improvement of the control system for these, for nuclear security in general. And they're not looking also at how all of the nuclear disciplines can be brought more closely together, so safety, safeguards, security. So I would just say, looking forward to 2014, I think there are basically 3 issues that I would define as the criteria for success. The first is a commitment to sustaining the high-level political attention to the issue, irrespective of future summits. So, in other words, the summit process got a new lease on life in Obama's Berlin speech. Now it's going to go to 2016, but that is going to be the end. And there has to be a way to sustain the political attention to this subject. Maybe it's through these IAEA conferences. Second, there has to be some kind of an agreement on the importance of greater information sharing and peer review, which I think Amano has pointed out very clearly. And finally, I think there needs to be recognition of the need for some kind of a unifying instrument, followed by a process for the development of this instrument. That's not to say that we need to negotiate something now. Our goal has always been, our strategy has always been 2-track. Short-term, voluntary, soft governance activities leading up to the eventual codification of these actions in some kind of an agreement. And so I hope that this conference this week is going to move us further down the line toward these objectives. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks a lot for coming. I won't speak too much because I'm not an expert in any of these topics. So,
I'm the co-chair of the Fissile Material Working Group, and I'm also a senior research associate at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies.